Hi everyone, hoping that you all are well. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to be talking about where is your tribe. This discussion is growing out of some of the very vocal discussions that you see in the digital world where individuals who identify as males and identify specifically as African American males are lodging various complaints about feminism, about being oppressed by women, about not being able to manifest their masculinity because of women. And they are specifically identifying women that they are identifying as African American women. In some instances, you have individuals who are identifying specifically as Hebrew Israelite, and they are identifying African American women as their women. And in many instances, you hear these repeated complaints about women not submitting, women not complying, women manifesting non-traditional roles. So you hear all of these complaints about a particular group of women. Now, there is a question about whether these complaints are actually organic or not. It may be that some of the joining in that has taken place more recently is organic, but the original manifestation of all of these complaints online, they may not be organic. They may simply be a social engineering dynamic that's actually aimed at what you would call African American men or brown American men, in order to make them appear emasculated, in order to make them appear weak and ineffectual. And so that's stated because many of the individuals who are claiming to be African American males making all of these complaints don't appear to be ethnically African American males. They appear to have ties to East Africa in one particular instance, some ties to the Caribbean, but essentially they don't appear to be what would be considered foundational Black Americans or Indigenous Black Americans or Indigenous Americans or Native Americans. And so something else is going on there. But what we're going to be talking about is where is your tribe? Because what may be happening in many of these instances is a disconnect between the male lineages and the female lineages. So in essence, these women may not be your women, and these men may not be your men. And so the goal may be to find your own tribe and then leave all of these other people alone instead of complaining about them. And so the theme of our discussion is not your tribe. We're going to be looking at some research related to DNA that points to this situation of having extreme diversity within the collective known as African Americans. And so in terms of genetics, in terms of ancestry, this is not one monolith. We are not talking about one collective of people. We are talking about a significant amount of diversity. And what you are looking at in many instances, it appears that there is a clash of cultures, because you had European men, you had African men, you had Asian men making their way to the Americas. And whenever you have a conquering dynamic, there's a conquering of the males and then taking of the females. And so the females remain in terms of the indigenous line, those females remain, but the male lines are quite diverse. And so, and this is particularly the case when you're talking about the men in the southeast and northeast regions. So those so-called African American men are not all African American men. You have these lineages that are coming out of Europe, you have these lineages that are coming out of Africa, Asia, and then you have some that may be indigenous lineages. But another thing to keep in mind is in terms of America and that southeast, northeast area, you have that dynamic of Big Mama's house. In other words, it's Big Mama's house. You have these matrilineal dynamics, and you have a lot of matriarchal manifestations prior to all of this colonization, all of this conquering. And so when you put that together with these uh, patriarchal dynamics and these patrilineal dynamics, it's very difficult to merge those two. And when you have people who are the descendants of that, they may carry all of these cultural dynamics with them, carry all of these ancestral dynamics with them without being fully aware of it. And so you may have women who are taking from their ancestors this matrilineal manifestation, and it may be clashing with this superimposing European African dynamic of patrilineal descent and patriarchy. And so you may have men who are carrying that, complaining about the women in Big Mama's house when they are simply manifesting that culture that has been passed down, and they may not even realize why they are manifesting what they are manifesting. Similarly, the males may not understand why they are manifesting what they are manifesting. But essentially what you have are individuals who have similar skin, but they are not really kin. But there are the assumptions of these similarities when they are not actually there. With respect to those who are identifying as Hebrew Israelite, you have a very specific dynamic going on here, very patrilineal dynamic, even if the patrilineal descent can't be proved at this point. But you have this culture, this belief system about this male rule, about this male line descent, and that is in direct contravention with respect to the American Indian groups that are matrilineal and that may even have matriarchal elements. And so we're going to talk about that. And to bring clarity to this point, we're going to look at a couple of articles. This one is Y Chromosome Lineages in Men of West African Descent. This is from 2012. And they make this interesting notation indicating that 30 to 40% of the paternal lineages in African descent populations in the Americas are of European ancestry. That actually makes absolutely no sense. And so, unless, of course, they are stating that the women are of African descent in the Americas and the men are of European ancestry, but saying that the men are of African descent, but they have this European ancestry is not hanging together. And so what's going on here is you have a large collective of men who are identified as African American, who are not actually African American. They are European American, if you're going to be specific about it with respect to this lineage dynamic. And so what is being manifested here is this heterogeneity in terms of the makeup of the men who've been classified as African American. And so they've been classified erroneously. That's the first part of it. But then you also have some male lineages that are left over from the indigenous people of America. And so this is another dimension that's added to this dynamic with respect to this diversity, this genetic diversity, that then translates to cultural diversity. Another interesting observation here is this identification of the character of the individuals who came into the Americas during the colonial period. And so here it's indicated that initially you had servants in the Americas that came from Europe, but came from West and West Central Africa. And they came initially as indentured servants, and then they were later enslaved. You saw the same dynamic going on with respect to the Europeans that were brought over. There were all sorts of clever ways to enslave them through indentured servitude or through this bonding out of individuals who violated the law. Another interesting thing here that's noted in terms of these numbers is that the vast majority of Africans were sold to European colonies in Latin America. And then you only have 4.5% of enslaved Africans being imported into the United States, and then only 7.8% going to Jamaica, and even fewer going to the U.S. Virgin Islands. It's almost none. And so you have all of these brown people. And the question becomes, of course, where did all of these brown people come from? Of course, we've talked about this before, and we know that Europe was cleaned out in terms of its brown population. You had a cleaning out, it appears, of the brown counterparts in many countries in the world, and then they were shipped off to Africa or shipped off to the Americas or other places. And then you have the indigenous people that were already there, because of course 4.5% of the enslaved Africans, that will not make up or create this vast population of brown people that we have here in America, or definitely not in Jamaica, where you have a predominance of brown people, or the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so something else has to account for this if it is not Africans being sold to these places. And so what you have are these unidentified or ignored indigenous populations where these other identities were superimposed onto them. And so cultures were also superimposed while their identities were also being appropriated. You also have some interesting notations with respect to the mitochondrial DNA. And so with quote unquote African Americans, the mitochondrial DNA is not completely matching with the DNA that you find in Africa. And so you see this similar diversity going on. And of course you would have that diversity because you have such a small number coming out of Africa in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. And so these mtDNAs are coming from somewhere else. And so again, you had that cleaning out of Europe of brown people along with some lighter people. You had this clearing out of different parts of Asia. You had a clearing out of India specifically. And so you had a large number of people being shipped over into the Americas. And so there's quite a bit of diversity. And so when individuals are claiming my people, or they are saying our women or our men, they are laying claim clearly to women and men that don't always belong to them. And so the men, even in your own families, may not belong to the women in the family. And by that I mean that the men in the family, that patrilineal line, may be coming out of Europe or Africa or Asia, and the women may be American women. And if the women are American women and they are descended from these indigenous women, they may be sending forth, in terms of their descendants, theories and paradigms, cultures that are in, again, direct contravention to what's coming out of Africa, what's coming out of Asia, what's coming out of Europe. And then you have individuals who are identifying specifically as Hebrew Israelite, for instance. So they are making a claim to a specific lineage. And the American Indian woman, or the indigenous American woman, is, generally speaking, probably not their woman. Now, there has been that 12 tribes chart that has been created, and what that does is it appropriates all of the identities in the Americas and lays claim to them for what would be considered Jacob. However, you see such cultural diversity and such DNA diversity, it's not realistic to assume that all of these people are actually under that umbrella of Jacob. And that is with respect to the male DNA and the female DNA. And so there is really no evidence to support this idea that they are all one. And in many ways, it looks like those who are identifying as Jacob are actually appropriating the cultures, appropriating the identities of various groups of people that are indigenous to the Americas, and simply giving them a label, saying that they are Gad, or saying that they are Benjamin, or saying that they are Simeon, does not mean that that's who they are. And given the fact that you have this significant history of matrilineal descent and some matriarchies in the indigenous populations, you see this conflict with this Hebrew Israelite narrative specifically, because it's not really possible to have both of these ancestral narratives running together. And so it's generally speaking either one or the other. And there's really no room with the Jacob narrative for this matrilineal descent, unless, of course, the matrilineal descent that has been found historically in the Americas is traced to Dinah. And so if it's traced to Dinah, and this is Jacob's daughters, just going down the line, then maybe there is something there. But generally speaking, it looks like you have a collective of males that are complaining about a collective of women that are not their women, and they are on the land of these women complaining about these women. And then you have these women in response often complaining about the males that are perhaps not their males, because the large collective of males were conquered in many instances. That's how colonization took place. And so therefore those would not be their males that they are complaining about. And so it may be essential in terms of peace, in terms of cultural identity, personal identity, to start to spend some time thinking about who you are as an individual, who you are as a family, and finding your tribe, and finding other collectives and unions within your specific tribe, versus generally seeing all brown people as your people from which to pick. And here again, in keeping with this article, you see that in analyzing these African American samples that were small, by the way, 40% did not match any sequence in the database for African ethnic groups. And so you have to have another narrative for these individuals. And as you can see from research that we've looked at before, a significant number of people who are identified as African American had these European mothers. We're talking about hundreds of years ago, but there was this European maternal line that you could see. That doesn't necessarily mean a light skin European maternal line, because again, there was a clearing out of Europe, and that clearing out involved not only lighter people but also darker people coming out of Europe. And so you've got quite a mix when you're talking about these individuals who've been lumped together as African American. And so another thing that is going on when you look at this 40 here, and then you saw the 40 in the other numbers, is that you have a high percentage of individuals who do not fit within that African American paradigm. A question is, of course, why has this narrative been pushed so hard? Even if the narrative about the African component was not completely accurate, why was the information about the European component also muddled? And so why was there this need, apparently, to create confusion around identity for those in the Americas? And so that includes definitely primarily the United States, Jamaica, Barbados, and then of course the Virgin Islands. As we wrap this up, we're going to consider one additional issue with respect to many of the collectives in the Americas being matrilineal and perhaps matriarchal, and how this clashed with these imposing cultures coming from Europe coming from Africa, coming from Asia. One thing that people may not be aware of is that in a matrilineal dynamic, and one that's matrilineal and matriarchal, you may have different roles for males. And so the importance of a male in a matrilineal dynamic comes from his mother. And so it's the mother's son that is the most important man in the narrative. And so it's the mother's son, it's the mother's grandson through the daughter. It's the grandsons coming after that through these daughters. And so the important male is not the one that marries into the family. It is the one that is the bloodline descendant in the family. And so you even have a situation in matrilineal dynamics where the children may not actually belong to the couple. They belong to the clan. They belong to the tribe. And so if the parents decide to go off somewhere, they can't necessarily, historically, they could not necessarily take the children with them because the children belong to the grandmother's clan. In other words, they belong to Big Mama's house. And so that idea of Big Mama may be something that is a part of the history and culture of American Indians, of indigenous people, because it's not something that you hear about. That phrase, you don't really hear about that in other cultures, even though it translates to Magna Mater, by the way. And so you have a different role for men, and the uncle becomes prominent in this situation. So the mother's brother takes on this paternal role because, again, the children belong to the mother's clan. And then the chief or the next king in line may very well be the mother's son, not her husband. Then not the son's son, but his sister's son. And so in that way, you address that whole dynamic of mama's baby and papa's maybe also. But again, this is in a conflict with this paradigm, this biblical paradigm that people are asserting in relation to American Indian or indigenous culture. It doesn't really hang together. And so if you have a matrilineal descent, a patrilineal descent is going to create some complications because you're not going to be as readily able to trace that descendant line the way you would be with a maternal line. And so also with respect to that Israelite dynamic, you have all of this diversity in terms of these Y haplogroups in America, and they are very distinct and they are very distant. And so it's highly unlikely that all of these males came from Jacob. And it's also highly unlikely that these males would be pushing back against women the way that some of them are if they were actually a part of the indigenous collectives, because it's almost like, carrying out that collective unconscious. And so you are probably talking about very different people. And instead of trying to superimpose one's identity onto another collective of people, it might be more appropriate to look for your own tribe and then bond with that collective. Phenotype is important, but phenotype is, of course, not everything. And in this instance, phenotype may be creating more confusion than clarity. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.